Hi, Don.
Hang on,
Hi, Don.
I was muted.
So thanks everyone for joining us today to hear Don Gaydon's presentation to look at different kinds of yield gaps. So this is work from CSIRO that's been considering different yield gaps, including physiological, economic and sustainable water yield gaps in different locations across the Indo-Gangetic Plains. Just by way of introduction, my name's Tamara Jackson, for those of you who don't know me, and I work with ACR to help manage the Sustainable Development Investment Portfolio, ACR SDIP. It's a program that works across the Eastern Gangetic Plains of Bangladesh, India and Nepal, with the aim of improving food, energy and water management for sustainable food systems. And it's part of a portfolio of work funded by the Australian Government's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So the ACR SDIP program goal is to maximise agriculture's contribution to sustainable food systems in the Eastern Gangetic Plains. And it looks at multiple elements of the food system and works at different scales from farm to regional levels. And within the program, there are a range of different projects that focus on promoting sustainable farming systems based on conservation agriculture to reduce water, energy and emissions. Projects identifying effective institutional arrangements for agricultural development, exploring biophysical and socioeconomic constraints and the impacts of change in agricultural systems, and synthesising the wider context of water and energy within the food system. So the project that Don will talk about today has looked, as I said, at the different kinds of yield gaps, so moving beyond just physiological and looking at economic and sustainable water, and looking at and quantifying these to see how they differ across the Indo-Gangetic Plains and how they're influenced by geography, resource availability, climate and water, economic settings and future climate outlooks. So Dr. Don Gaydon has been leading the project with inputs from his colleague, Dr. Balwinder Singh at CIMMYT. Don is a principal research scientist with CSIRO, where his research combines field experimentation, participatory engagement and cropping system modelling to improve management options for farmers both in Australia and internationally. So just a couple of housekeeping rules before we start. Please just keep your microphone on mute unless you're invited to comment or you need to ask a question. My colleague Kuhu Chatterjee will moderate a question session after Don's presentation. And if you want to make a question or ask a question or make a comment, just make a note in the comments box, the chat box, and Kuhu will ask you to put those questions to Don after the presentation. But please try and keep your comments and questions concise so we can get through a few different questions. And I'd like to pass over to Don now to start his presentation.
Good, thanks Tamara, and good afternoon or good morning everyone, depending on where you are. Greetings from Brisbane, where it's about 3 p.m. So I'm hoping you can all see my title slide. The presentation's title is Crop Yield Gaps SRA. SRA, for anyone who's not aware, is just stands for Small Research Activity. And this project has run for 12 months. It's just was an idea that I talked with Robin Johnson about a year or so ago, and suggested that it needed a little bit more investigation to see whether there was anything in it to follow up further. So I'll tell you a little bit about that in the course of the presentation. But the work I'm presenting here includes, what would you say, some background to what the idea is and some of the work we've done across the Indo-Gangetic Plain looking at yield gaps, and represents work by myself and Balwinder Singh from CIMMYT. So the genesis of the idea, I guess, came in the food security world. All the discussions about crop yield gaps seem to be about this initial type of yield gap called a physiological yield gap. It's basically what yields are the farmers achieving now for their wheat crops, their rice crops, or maize crops, or lupin crops, or whatever, and what is physiologically possible to grow in that environment, given that radiation, temperatures, and so forth. What is the physiological maximum yield you can grow, and how does that compare with what farmers are doing now? And this seemed, to my reckoning anyway, in the literature and in discussions, seemed to constitute about 99% of discussions of yield gap. Now, I would argue it's not necessarily the most important yield gap for food security considerations. It sort of says what's possible to grow, but there are more relevant yield gaps, which I'll talk about a bit further. So we've looked at physiological yield gaps. We've also looked at this thing that I'm calling an economic yield gap. And the third one is awkward term, but describes it best, I think, unless someone can come up with a better term: water sustainable yield gap. So I'll just explain these in a little bit more detail. And in this project, we've looked at three major crops across the IGP and at a number of sites, which I'll explain further. So firstly, this idea of physiological yield gap is nicely, I think, explained on axes like these. If you look at the crop grain yield response to increasing amounts of an input, a limiting input, let's say, for example, nitrogen. So I'm hoping you can see my pointer here. So if you're not putting any nitrogen on the crop, you're going to end up with a low yield, but there'll be a certain yield there because some nitrogen is available from indigenous sources. Some nitrogen falls in the rain, and there's soil organisms that can fix nitrogen from the air. So even if you don't put any nitrogen on your crops, you can attain a certain very low yield. So as you increase the amount of nitrogen you're adding to your crop, the yield increases if it's nitrogen limited, until you get to a point where it starts to plateau out and the yield starts to be limited by things other than nitrogen, and you can put as much more nitrogen on as you want, and you're not going to get any more yield. The crop is already nitrogen unlimited. So that's this point up here, which we'd call the potential yield. So this is assuming other inputs are unlimited as well. So if we've got a farmer yield down here, you would talk about this idea of a physiological yield gap, meaning the difference between what the farmers are currently getting and what they could potentially get in that environment if there was no limitations on nitrogen, water, and the prevailing conditions of temperatures and solar radiation prevail. Although it's important to think about a bit like a farmer here. If we plot on the other axis, the gross margins or the profit the farmer makes, the picture's a little bit different. Yes, the gross margin increases up to a certain point where the rate of increase in yield with continuing applied nitrogen, in this case, starts to decrease, and eventually you get to a point where the yield increases don't match the costs of the increasing nitrogen. You start to get a drop off in your gross margin or your profit. So that's could be thought of as a maximum economic yield. It's not the same thing as the maximum physiological yield, the maximum economic yield. And the difference between that physiological yield gap and the economic yield gap varies with location or varies with environment. So we could call this, for the purpose of our presentation today, the economic yield gap. That's the difference between what the farmer's achieving and where they could be achieving in terms of their maximum gross margin. Now, the thing about the physiological yield gap, it's a function of the crop type, the variety, and the environment. But the economic yield has some policy cost price elements in it. For example, if you increase or decrease the cost of nitrogen, the point at which you maximize your yield will change, and that hence changes your economic yield gap. So economic yield gap is a function of policy settings as well, whereas physiological yield gap isn't. Okay, the third yield gap we're looking at is what we've sort of called the water sustainable yield gap. And just, I'll go into this a little bit more, but for a start, if you consider this is a map of Bangladesh from a study of Matt Kirby and some others a while ago, and the red dots are wells which appear to be overexploited, given that the well levels are dropping with time, and the blue dots are wells that seem to, they draw down in the Rabi season, but then they go back up to the same level in the Kharif season and don't seem to be being overexploited. So I guess if a farmer's yielding here and they're actually in one of these red zones where it's declining, you could argue that to bring that into sustainability, the farmer should be applying less irrigation. I'll go into this. There's quite a few complexities in saying this, but on the simple side, you could talk about a water sustainable yield if you're in a overexploited areas being below where the farmer currently is, or potentially if the groundwater resource is underexploited, the yield could be higher. So for the purpose of this project, we've called this a sustainable yield gap, sustainable water yield gap. And it can be positive or negative depending on whether the water resource is over or underexploited. So we started with the assumption that these yield gaps are likely to vary fairly widely across the IGP. So for the purpose of this project, we selected a number of sites from the east to the west, including a number of the SRFSI sites here, and some also in UP and Haryana and Punjab as well, to give a bit of a feeling for how these yield gaps vary across the IGP. And as it's a one-year project, and we've had a number of these, and in fact all of these sites, we've done fairly rigorous testing and validation of the APSIM model. We've used that as a quantitative tool to sort of understand a little bit about what's happening. And the comparison, as I mentioned, are affected by economic and environmental settings and levers. So the sort of situation you could see going from between two sites here and how these yield gaps might vary. Site one, let's say somewhere in the EGP, I don't know, say somewhere in West Bengal. Site two, let's take somewhere in the far west, say Punjab. So I've got some real figures to show you in a minute, but this is just a schematic. The idea being that the farmer yield in the EGP is relatively low compared to what it could potentially be. The farmer yield is also below the economic maximum, and it's below the sustainable water yield if you're in an area that's underexploited from a water resource point of view. However, in Punjab, we know that the farmer yield's already up close to potential yields and pretty well close to maximising economic yields, but there's an argument that the groundwater resource is overexploited. It's more than an argument, it is overexploited, and something has to be done about production in those areas if it's going to be sustainable. So I'll just step through some of the learnings so far from the project. Physiological yield gaps, the potential crop yields are lower in the Eastern Gangetic Plain when we do the simulations in APSIM. And the physiological yield gaps are actually bigger. So farmers in the West are closer to their potential than currently in a lot of the sites we looked at in the EGP. And the reasons are several. They include things like why are farmers not achieving higher in the EGP? Well, there's things to do with electricity price, availability of electricity, licensing for groundwater pumping, availability of machines, economies of scale, etc. So that's a trend across our sites. Generally, in the Western Gangetic Plains, farmers are achieving closer to their potential yield than in the east. In terms of the economic yield gaps, once again, this is just one I've plucked out from Dinajpur in Bangladesh. Bit of a messy graph there, apologies, but the blue is the yield response, one off the original graph I showed you. and the gross margin response for wheat is in that browny colour, I guess. So, you know, there's valid reasons why a farmer doesn't try to get maximum physiological yields, you know, quite apart from that mightn't necessarily maximise their profit. There's also a, you know, the farmer needs to find a risk level in terms of year-to-year variability in yields that they're comfortable with as well. Obviously, if there's a risky cropping environment, the farmer might be more hesitant to apply large amounts of nitrogen, particularly if there's unreliable water supplies for a rabi crop like wheat. There's unreliable water supplies. A farmer might know full well that if they had guaranteed good water for that year, they'd apply more N, but they apply less because they don't know whether that's going to be guaranteed or not. So there's something related to the risk as well as the actual profit point. Now, I already said that. So we're looking at the effect of plus or minus 10 to 20% subsidies on electricity, cost of fuel, cost of fertiliser and grain price, to just have a look at how these things vary across the IGP. Some of this data has been easy to come by, some has been difficult, particularly with my colleague Balwinder in India, who when we started this, which was pre-COVID, he had planned to do a lot of travel and actually visit and talk to people, which really hasn't been possible. So he's been a little bit limited, but nonetheless. So getting to the water sustainable story, how over or under exploited is groundwater as you move across the IGP? So we've accessed a number of reports like this one. This is from the Central Groundwater Board in India, and they across districts right across the IGP, they've done reports that in different, so this one's the Karnal, these are different sub-districts, basically saying they've made an assessment through hydrological means, I guess, of the net groundwater availability, the existing draft, so the existing amount that's being taken out, and what that is as a percentage of that. So, you know, in the case of Haryana, just about everything's overexploited. There, what's assessed to be the sustainable level, the draft is greater than that in just about all the sites. Now that changes significantly as you move across, even India, across towards the east. So I've sort of plotted that up. So that graph there, let me just explain it before you try and get your heads around it. The y-axis is the percent of groundwater exploited. So I guess if it's a 0, you're not using any groundwater. It's not, you're not pumping anything. If it's 100% exploited, in terms of exploited, I'm meaning the amount that recharges is about the same as what you're taking out. So it's being used sustainably. And that over or under exploited is calculated as I showed on that previous table. So as you can see, moving sort of from Karnal or Punjab in the west right through to the east, you see there's a decline in the exploitation level of the groundwater resources, as reported by the Indian Central Groundwater Board, which is quite interesting to see. But you know, maybe people are already well aware of that, but it's good to actually plot it down. I hadn't seen anyone actually plot it up, so we actually plotted it up. So the question is to bring a overexploited area back into sustainable water resource use or exploitation. How will production be impacted? So this is an example study we did for that same one, Karnal in Haryana. The groundwater is currently overexploited by 30%, 130% exploitation. Now, to make that sustainable, that doesn't mean reducing irrigation pumping by 30%. This is a point I need to make at this point. It means reducing ET, That's total evapotranspiration by 30%. And this is the reason. If you look at the water balance in a cropping system, and this applies to a cropping system where deep percolated water here goes down back into the groundwater and can be repumped and reused. So it's not a loss term, unless that groundwater happens to be saline, or unless that groundwater, I don't know, ends up straight into the ocean or something like that. We assume that deep percolation is not a loss term. So if it's not a loss term, what it means is the only real losses are evaporation, so soil evaporation, and transpiration, so water transpired through the crop leaves. So in other words, if you're going to reduce your overexploitation by 30%, you've actually got to reduce ET by 30%, not ET plus deep percolation, which would be what your irrigation is. So this graph shows yield on the y-axis, and this is a number of different farming system options. So the columns show the yield. The lines here refer to the Y2 axis, which is gross margin. So the ES in this case is an electricity subsidy. So we looked at the effect of a, I don't think I've got it on this graph, I think it was a 20% electricity subsidy. So in other words, I think what it is the yellow one is the current situation in Carnal where there is an electricity subsidy, and if you remove the electricity subsidy, the gross margin looks like the green curve here. So what's this saying? FP is farmer practice. Farmer practice with AWD, so it's alternate wetting and drying in the rice phase. This one here is farmer practice with 30% less irrigation, which is sort of a false saving of 30%. And this last one is farmer practice where you actually reduce the reduce irrigation pumping to the extent that you reduce ET by 30% less. So this is a truly sustainable level of water extraction, not this one here, not the 30% less irrigation. So as you can see, the effect of simply keeping the cropping systems exactly the same, so a rice wheat system, and reducing the irrigation such that ET is 30% less, significant impact on yields and also on farmer gross margins. So it's not really an option to say we're going to continue with a rice wheat system and we're just going to irrigate, pump less. There'll be huge losses of production and profit to farmers. So we looked at other options. What about reducing the area of production versus changed crop mix? So the ET of rice is about 820 millimetres per crop. This is dry season rice. Sorry. No, this is Kharif rice. And maize is around 352, so it's Kharif maize. So in the Kharif season, what's it look like if you think about, instead of a 100% rice wheat area, you look at a composite rice maize area in the Kharif, followed by 100% wheat in the Rabi. So at this end, we're looking at 100% rice, right up to the other end. We can do this in a model without anyone going broke. 100% maize up this other end, and we're looking at the total system ET. So as you can see, if it's 100% rice, 820 millimetres ET. If it was all maize in the Kharif, it would be 352. So it turns out that to bring that Carnal node into sustainability, it's around a 30% reduction in ET. So that would be about a 50-50 rice maize in the Kharif would bring that area into a sustainable level of water use. So in other words, that's the previous graph I had. We've just popped this one on here again, except the columns are now ET rather than yield, this one. On the Y2 axis, the yellow columns, and the other one is still your gross margins. So the rice maize system basically looks a lot more sensible in terms of your farmer gross margin, but the ET is about the same as that previous option. So, yeah, this is totally skipping over the fact whether it's feasible economically or market-wise to substitute half the rice area with maize. It's just looking at the biophysical side in terms of water use. So yeah, for the same reduction in E2, a 50-50% of normal rice and maize gives a 7 times greater profit to the farmer than sustainable rice alone. If you include AWD with the rice, that figure there moves to a 60-40 mix. So in other words, you can get by with your 60% rice, 40% maize if you implement the alternate wetting and drying irrigation in maize, in the rice. Okay. This one here looks at a long-term effect of each of those different strategies. So in this case, rice RW is rice wheat, the current rice wheat system. Rice wheat AWD is the current rice wheat system, but AWD in the rice. Maize wheat, replacing all the rice with maize. Rice wheat minus 0.7 RET, well, that's 70% current rice system with 30% reduced ET, so that's what we've been talking about. And then a 40-60 is rice and maize during 40-60, yeah, okay. So 40-60 land ratio, rice to maize, followed by normal wheat. So looking at the groundwater resources, you can see the first ones, the rice wheat and the rice wheat with AWD continue to run down the water resources. They're not alternate wetting and drying by itself doesn't look in any way, shape or form like it's a solution to the water problems in Karnal. The green one here, which is the rice maize wheat, 50% rice maize, sort of looks like it's bringing it into sustainability, and these other ones here are actually conversion totally to maize wheat and dumping the rice out of the Western Gangetic Plains. Sort of certainly will start to bring water resources back into very sustainable levels, and in fact start to build up your groundwater levels with time. Okay. So what's this work achieving? So we're looking at these sort of analyses, I guess, at all our nodes. We're getting a point-scale understanding of the relevant crop yield gaps and the effect of the geography and the policy settings across the IGP. Hopefully it will lead to better informed policy, provision to answers to questions like what yields are physiologically possible, but what yields are economically desirable, and differentiating those two if need be. And we looked at a range of current and alternative economic settings. Another question, how do limitations on sustainable use of water resources impact target yields or optimum sort of crop mixes, I guess, we're sort of framing it as. Keep in mind, it's an SRA, it's a small research activity. It's meant to be a scoping study that if anything more interesting comes out of this, we could potentially use this to frame up a larger project. How do conservation, agri and climate change impact the above? And how do any of these answers vary across the IGP? So, you know, in the long run, when this is maybe more robustly looked at, better informed farmer extension services and researchers. The post-SRA opportunities, we think it sort of, see, the story in the West is very different to the story in the East. And it sort of speaks towards the need for if we're going to bring the whole lot into a balance, something that looks sustainable across the entire Indo-Gangetic Plains. Some of the water extraction from the West needs to be transferred to the West. I mean, the region still needs food. It's not simply a matter of saying we're going to grow less food. So where can we increase production of various crops and where can we decrease production of various crops and maybe increase crops of others? How can we balance the IGP, bring production into line with the resources? So, I mean, as part of that question, yeah, it's a little bit controversial maybe with the focus on crop intensification that's been happening in the Eastern Gangetic Plains. But I think there's a fair argument that the crop intensification and diversification really should also be looked at very closely in the Western Gangetic Plains with an aim of removing rice production out of or decreasing rice production in the region. And given that India and other countries in the region still need rice, the balance would mean growing more rice in the Eastern Gangetic Plains, where the water resources are less exploited. So that is a thing that pops into my head, I guess, as a possible consequence of the idea of balancing this. It's not necessarily along the line that SDIP has been looking, where the focus has been on crop diversification in the Eastern Gangetic Plains. I think there's an argument we should ask, should the Eastern Gangetic Plains be viewed as an area for crop diversification, or where we should focus rice production? So I might just leave that there, because this project certainly doesn't answer that question. It just looks at, issues around balancing. So obviously we've just looked at 8 sites or so across the IGP. They're just point scale. To look at this in a more robust fashion, you definitely need to look more regionally rather than at points, because a point doesn't represent a whole region, of course. So we can see linking this sort of philosophy with GIS, hydrology, someone with better socioeconomic skills than us, and some of those, let's say, synergistic type skills, we can optimise this sort of trade-off across from the west to the east. I think it can be done. What we see is integration across the whole IGP is missing. People are looking at the various small regions or aspects and trying to come up with what's best for them without thinking about the whole system. So we sort of envisage a larger project building on this SRA, but at this stage, we're not sure how we can fund or support that, or who would even run it. I'm sort of quite interested in it, but I mean, there's a number of people or organisations who could run such a project. That's my last slide, so I might leave it there tomorrow. Open for any, or Kuhu, I think, open for any discussion or questions or comments.
Lots of questions for you, Don.
I don't know if I can answer them, but
some of them look more as clarification, because Dr. Das from Kuch Bihar is asking, what is taken as the potential yield? Is it a mix of all the three, or what do you mean by potential yield? The physiological?
Oh, okay. Potential yield we refer to as that physiological yield. What is the physiological potential of the crop in that region? So it's the yield that's only limited by temperatures and solar radiation, under the assumption that there's no nitrogen limitations, no water limitations. So that's what we refer to as potential yield.
Hello, Kuhu?
Yeah, please.
Can you allow me to tell something? Hello?
Sure, Kathy?
Yes.
Yeah.
Please.
Hi, Don. Actually, I mean to say here that, you know better that yield cap, while we will be calculating yield cap, we should be very much cautious about defining the frontier. Now, for a farmer situation, what should be the frontier? Is it the experimental yield, what we are treating, what we are conducting in a suppose in a laboratory or in a very much protected experimental condition? Or if we conduct a trial, suppose in the vicinity of the farmers, but because this is when we are conducting a trial in the vicinity of the farmer, it is almost similar to the farming condition. So I think while defining the potential yield, we should be taking the yield which is very much achievable for the farmer and which is near to him. So that's the yield. I think it will be better for defining the yield cap. then we will be identifying the actual yield gap.
Okay.
Well, we tried to do that. We've using a lot of the data from SRIPSI and also similar data that's been collected by CIMMIT and others in the West. We've used actual farmer yields. Actual farmer yields. You saw on a couple of those graphs I had the farmer yield, but they're not from a research station. They're actual farmer yields.
Okay. The next question comes from Professor Ganesh Kumar. Would you like to clarify your question, Professor?
Good morning, and thank you for a good presentation, Don. My question is simple, and it is in fact closely related to the earlier point also. Is the potential yield itself constant, or does it vary across different locations? Like, would it be higher in, say, Punjab compared to, say, the other end in Bangladesh? And would it vary down the IGP point? I'm talking of the potential yield.
Yeah, I get your question, I think. No, potential yield definitely varies between location. Different temperatures, different solar radiation, and definitely varies even between seasons. So for a particular site, we'd talk about an average potential year across a number of different seasons, but it will definitely vary between sites because they have different solar radiations, different temperature regimes, all of which affect crop production and what the crop can actually produce, even for exactly the same variety. So it varies. Yeah, it's not something that's just tied to a crop type or a variety. It's a potential yield at a certain location.
Okay.
I had a related question. Then the potential yield is varying. Then are the yield gaps then estimated according to the local potential?
Yes. Yeah. At each of in this analysis we've got 8 sites, and at each site we've calculated the potential yield, and we have the farmer yield. So that yield gap, takes into account geographical differences in potential yield as well as farmer yield. So we've actually, in terms of running the farmer simulations in APSIM, we've used the actual farmer management practices where we can get hold of them. Farmers may well be, for example, putting on less nitrogen than they would need to if they were going to approach a higher, even maximum economic yield. But as I mentioned before, sometimes they quite purposely choose a lower end simply out of risk concerns. It's not, there's a downside if you choose an end level that's going to maximize your economic yield, but you're not sure whether you're going to have water this year, for example. So farmers, so we've tried to quantify what farmers are actually doing, and we're well aware there are reasons for that. There's no sense of saying, look, farmers are stupid, because they're not. Farmers do things for a good reason, and generally, although they may be unaware of some things, but often they're a lot more aware of other things that the researchers mightn't be aware of. So, but we've actually tried to, in the SRFSI project and other bits of work, we've actually collected farmer yields and collected details of farmer management, and that's what we've used.
Okay, I think the next I will ask Dharma to ask his question. He's asked a number of questions. If you could be precise and short and combine your questions. Dharma?
I just talked about this, climate impact. I did not see that, climate data were being used. So that's why I just asked that question. However, I heard from Don that he has been explaining about seasonal variation, ET and temperature have been used. Am I correct?
Yeah. That's right. So the APSIM model that we used to generate those things, it uses daily climate data with daily maximum minimum temperatures, solar radiation and rainfall. So we run the simulations for, depending on the site and how much climate data we've got, sort of up to 30 plus years. So when we run the model, it captures a variability. So if I've shown average figures there, they're probably the average over 35 years with a certain variability around it. And as for climate change figures, I didn't present any. If you meant climate change.
Right. That's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
And also, there's is there any sort of water sustainability? Did you use any sort of technology, sort of thing, right? Like irrigation technologies to maximize water sustainability?
Well, we looked at the impact of, in rice, at least, alternative wetting and drying. Right. So technologies like that, in terms of different sort of irrigation methods like flood irrigation or sprinkler irrigation, we haven't looked at that.
Okay, right. Yeah, there's some other aspect, is it?
We particularly want to look at alternate wetting and drying because, you hear it said that, oh, well, you can solve a lot of the Punjab's water overexploitation by implementing better alternate wetting and drying. Well, that's we wanted to look at, investigate whether that was the case or not.
Right. That's okay. And also, you have been talking about rice. Are there any different varieties? Have you been used?
Yeah.
Only one variety.
It's like a real Pandora's box. If you open up too many things, so what we've done at each location we've used, we've picked varieties of wheat, rice, and maize that are locally used. So, it would have, rices that are used in the West are different to rices that are used in the East, for example. And, I guess we could have expanded the study to look at all the rices everywhere, but we haven't done that. Our studies at each node are basically using just existing varieties and looking at how they perform.
Yeah, that's right. Why I asked that question was because different rice can yield different, from different inputs. That's why.
Yeah, no, very true. Very true.
Yeah, to move on. I will ask.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I would like to ask Irene to ask a question or make a comment. Is Irene here? Okay.
He had to leave, Kuhu, but she made a comment. I'll pass it on to Don afterwards.
Yeah, okay. So then next is Aditi. Aditi, has she left?
No, I haven't. Yes. No,
yeah,
thank you. Thanks, Don. Very interesting presentation. And I have always felt that the work you guys are doing is absolutely very, very policy relevant as it helps answer some of these big questions, like the kind of cropping we have in northwestern India just won't be sustainable forever. And there, showing alternatives, I think, is just so important. But of course, you already know that. A couple of things is this physiological yield kind of a fixed thing? I know the conventional wisdom has always been that Eastern India's physiological yield is lower, and that's exactly what you say. But then I'm a bit puzzled because Bangladesh has achieved very high yields in Boro, which I believe is almost comparable to Punjab yield. So is there something to be said about appropriate seeds that are being particularly bred for, these kind of humid, cloudy kind of, skies? So that was one. Then my other question was more around the showing this maize versus rice intercropping and that productivity can go up to 70%. What were the assumptions? Because if that is so, I am not sure why farmers would resist shifting and becoming, doing the 60-40 maize and rice, because if the profits are high, has it something to do with policies like, guaranteed minimum support price? And if that is so, then there is this recent farm bill, which kind of, I'm not entirely sure of all the implications of the farm bill, but it can make some difference because I think, Yeah, well, there may be others in this webinar who know more than I do on that. So yeah, that was my major second question. And the third is, I absolutely agree with you that perhaps Eastern India is not the best place to be diversifying, and perhaps here we need to grow more rice. But there is also a lot of local resistance to growing rice. I mean, Bodo paddy, for instance, has such a bad name within West Bengal, for instance, including among agricultural universities about it, leading to groundwater over exploitation, etc. So how do you change those kind of local narratives and kind of, tell a more pan-India picture? Because the local narratives are very localized. It's just comparing a temporal, like, we used to have our water table at 2 meters, now it's at 3 meters. So that kind of local narrative goes. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer number 3. There's probably other people in the hookup who can answer number 3 better than I. I go back to the first one, the question about yield potential being higher in the west than in the east. It is linked to variety, but it's also linked to heat. Like if you look at wheat, I think some of the record wheat yields in the whole world, I don't know if it's still the record, but I think New Zealand or Germany had some of the highest wheat yields. Now, the reason being that it's when the wheat's growing there, it's quite cool. The season's very long, and there's a long time to accumulate assimilates of photosynthesis and so forth. So even though it's, maybe not the greatest photosynthesis or the greatest solar radiation, you can still grow the biggest yields in cooler sort of areas. And but it's fairly complex. I mean, it's a combination of radiation, but also the temperature regime, which sets how long the crop grows for. And of course, it's the genetics of the varieties that are being used as well. So I guess all I can say is that what we did was, as I was saying with Dharma's question, we used local varieties in each of our nodes. And in those ones, we gave that local variety unlimited water and nitrogen. So no stresses at all in water and nitrogen, and just let the temperature regime and the radiation play out with those local varieties to determine potential yield. So yeah, so a potential yield figure I gave for Punjab, you could bring in a totally different variety from somewhere else and put it there, and that potential yield for that variety could be lower or higher. It's very much an interactive thing, which is why we use the models. And so that's the first one. The second question was about some of the assumptions that we made in terms of support prices. And yeah, if the farmers can, I think if I go back to that graph, I think I can still do it. Let me just go back. Yeah, I think this might have been the one you're looking at, with gross margins sort of highest of all with 50-50 rice maize, and you're saying, why don't farmers do it? Look, it could be, keep in mind that, is there a market for 50% of Punjab and Haryana to grow maize? I really have no idea. This is where I said this analysis we've done is a little bit dumb about the real market limitations. We sort of make that quite clear in our preamble to say this is not sort of making any assessment as to whether farmers could switch over to 50% maize in the Kharif and be able to sell it. Or, if every farmer switched over into 50% maize, the maize price could go tumble. So all we've done is taken current maize prices and assumed and looked at what happened if a farmer went 50-50. They could bring their water use into sustainable basis, but could they sell all that maize, or would the price tumble? I've got no idea. So this is a big question, and all we're trying to contribute is some of the biophysical insights, I guess, in terms of water use and crop production. So as for support prices and whether that keeps farmers growing rice, look, I don't know, Aditi. I really don't know. I'd like to have my colleague Balwinder here to answer that. He did all the work for those sites in the west, and he sort of, he knows them intimately, having grown up on a rice wheat farm and now working as a researcher. So, but as far as I know, we didn't go into those depths at all in terms of support price and what effect that's having on farmer decisions. It wasn't our aim. And your third one about how do you change local narratives? Yeah, no idea. Anything I could say wouldn't have a lot of wouldn't carry a lot of weight anyway. But yeah, I do believe you have that phenomena where you do get local narratives about what can and can't be done, and sometimes they're very difficult to break.
I think we will move on to the last two questions because we are running out of time. I will ask Mahesh to make his comment or his question. Mahesh?
Thank you very much, Don, for good presentations.
Good day, Mahesh.
My small observation that, you mainly focus on diversification of rice wheat from northwest to take in eastern part. It seems that politically, because these crops are, very important and food security also, it's not going to be happening soon. So rather than, and also reducing, 30%, it is also not an easy task. It's difficult. But I don't know, we should be more focused on if you look at that, the percolation of Northwest India soils is reduced significantly, manifold times. So there is no recharge system available right nowadays in Northwest because due to compaction and runoff more and all. So can we capture that if you improve percolations in Northwest and then recharge our aquifers by through management, somehow that's, nowadays we are talking about conservation agriculture and so on. So that can be help in future or not. Definitely diversification and I would say optimization, which you already focus on, like 50-50 or, diversify with rice with maize. It's one of the most, maybe soybean, maybe other crops, but that's again comes to question mark on the market, that's is not observable. But immediate, I'm looking is to focus on to improve the populations, which can recharge, the system and aquifers that can be more sustainable at least for longer time and meet, to like over exploitation happening that we can be, meet and then, mitigate on that.
Yeah, that's interesting, Mahesh. So if I just make sure I understand what you just said. So you're saying that the percolation where, excess water is entering the groundwater table again is not happening efficiently in the West. And you're saying that it could be worth looking into the potential to actually improve percolation or recharge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you are right.
Yeah. Well, I guess in our analysis, we just assumed that anything that's going below in the model, anything that's going below the crop roots is ending up in the groundwater again, and it's not a loss. So, yeah, I guess all I can say is that's what we assumed. If that's not in fact the case, and some of that water that's percolating below the crop roots is in fact a loss. Like a good example of where that is a loss in the Indo-Gangetic Plains, if you look in the saline zones in Bangladesh or even saline zones anywhere across, as soon as your fresh water is ending up in the saline groundwater, it is effectively lost. You can't use it again. So in that case, then you don't just look at ET, you'd look at ET plus that percolation as a loss, and that would change the whole equation as to what where the balance lies for sustainability significantly. So, yeah, I just take on board what you said, and I might use it in some of the discussion actually in our report as we're writing it up, that if in fact in the Western Gangetic Plains, some of that deep percolation is in fact really is a loss, then it does change the balance and it would need to be sort of assessed on that basis.
Okay. Mahesh, are you okay? Happy with your answers? We will give the questions to Don if he wants to.
No, thank you, Kuhu. We will, discuss later on more details because this is the time give opportunity to others.
I think I will just the last questions from Hugh Turrell, if he wants to combine his questions and get Don to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Kuhu. They're both very simple questions. So the first one is just to explain why maize ET is so much lower than rice ET. I guess you get that from measurements and from APSIM modeling, but that's quite a big difference that I think is a bit surprising to me. And the second one is you mentioning discussion around alternate wetting and drying. And I was wondering what APSIM says about alternate wetting and drying compared with observed practice in the field. So my experience in China, for example, is that AWP ends up with considerable reductions in yield, which are not actually very interesting to farmers anyway.
Yeah, hi Hugh.
Hi, Don.
We've exchanged email, but we've never actually spoken.
So I'll switch on so you can see my ugly face as well.
Okay, I'll go to the first one, which was about ET of rice and maize. Yeah, look, that figure, rice ET is higher simply because of higher evaporation early, before you get full canopy closure, and simply because you've got the water, the pond, where you're losing water, and it's also in pre-transplanting or sowing operations where you've got puddle fields and you need to keep the field saturated, so you're losing a lot of water at that stage. But those figures are pretty reasonable. That's even from my experience with rice here in Australia. In fact, a total ET for rice crops in Australia here in the Riverina got an ET about 1,200.
But they're very long season.
Because it's a longer season, much longer season. But it's a similar ratio, you know. Crops that don't have flooded soil have lower ET. And I mean, if you look at the period after the canopy, you know, full canopy closure, where your evaporation from the water surface is reduced because it's not exposed, then in that phase, the crops, the ET is less. Sorry, the ET is more similar.
Yeah.
But over the whole crop, the way it's currently practiced, the ET is about, and those figures that we've quoted there that are coming out of APSIM are very commensurate with what's in the literature. Now, AWD. So there's a lot of papers around, particularly the IRI, published from the IRI guys, about this concept of safe AWD, that if the AWD is fairly mild, so in other words, you let the pond dry down, and they often use these like PVC pipes in the field, and when the water level in the pipe drops to like 10 centimetres below the soil surface, they re-irrigate. And IRI call that safe AWD, and there's a lot of stuff in the literature that significant irrigation water input losses, input savings can be had from that with minimal yield loss. But however, if you go longer than that, you can end up with more significant yield loss. So without knowing exactly the situation in China you're talking about, yeah, if the rice as a crop is very sensitive to water stress, and so if you go past that safe, what IRI called the safe AWD limit, I can easily flick you off a few papers on this, then you do start to incur yield loss, yes. And even though you're then reducing the irrigation water, your water productivity or your yield per millimetre can be reduced if you don't set your AWD properly. So the thing is here though, you know, there's lots of stuff about AWD and how much it can save you in irrigation, but what we're saying here is that some of that irrigation is actually going into the groundwater and it's not a loss. So we've reduced our analysis and just looking at the ET.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have for questions. And my personal interest would be to see how this kind of a modeling process could help us in planning, you know, diversification, or where should one grow rice or not. And we will share the questions with you, Don, and I'll hand over to Tamara, who will make some closing points. And thank you very much, Don.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for the interest of everyone and comments.
Thank you, Kuhu, and everyone's questions. And yeah, thanks, Don, for a great presentation. I think it's, you know, this is obviously, as you said, just a small research activity. So it's really, it couldn't answer all questions, but I think it does give a, you know, demonstrates what you could do in this space in terms of looking at the different yield gaps and trying to look at some options for improving sustainability. I guess a lot of the interesting questions I think were around, you know, kind of, I guess the nuance behind it. So rather than just, you know, replacing rice with something else, there's a whole, you know, argument around that. And it's also looking at what, I guess, more widely than just East versus West in India as well. And Irene Kerno made an interesting point that, you know, she's a horticultural specialist, so she's always interested in nutritional sufficiency of different system options too. But I think, you know, what you've done is show the basis for what could be done, and we could really build on this work and help, as Kuhu said, help with kind of planning and looking at where we diversify and where we don't. So thank you, and thanks everyone for joining us today and for a good discussion.
Thank you, everyone.
Nice to see everyone.